I'm going to talk to you today about reimagining privacy for the networked information society. And it's a really, really condensed version of the privacy materials in my forthcoming book. So I may not get through all of it, but if you will have questions, then we can finish. What I would like to submit to you is that if we are going to reimagine privacy for the networked information society, we need to get rid of just about everything that we think we know about what privacy is. What do I mean by that? Well, we all hear every day that privacy is under siege, privacy is threatened because of changing technology and changing social practices. And I don't want to talk about that. What I want to talk about is a different way that privacy is threatened, which is ideologically. And I don't mean what you think I mean. I'm not going to try to argue with the people who say that we are all choosing to be profiled. I want to talk instead about the ways that the theoretical justifications offered by privacy advocates work to place privacy inside a very narrow conceptual box and ultimately, I think, frustrate the project of conceptualizing privacy. The narrow conceptual box that I am referring to consists of the descriptive and normative framework imposed by liberal political theory on privacy. And I think that confining privacy within the limits of liberal political theory turns out to be a very bad idea, both theoretically and politically. So I want to introduce three kinds of problems that this reliance on liberal theory creates for privacy. And I call them the autonomy paradox, the information processing imperative, and the disembodied self. So the autonomy paradox refers to a way that privacy advocates link privacy to a conception of the self that is theoretically unsustainable and that seems to lead to a politics of privacy that is naive and old-fashioned. Privacy advocates like to argue that privacy plays an essential role in preserving human dignity and autonomy in a changing world. So that argument posits that what privacy does is shelter the fixed autonomous self from being battered by technological and social change. And of course, because the world only changes all the time, that sounds old-fashioned immediately. Let's think a little harder, though, about the autonomy piece. So exactly how we should think about autonomy is debated among privacy advocates. Some people argue for a negative view of autonomy, and others for a positive view of autonomy. And both of those views, though, have really difficult problems associated with them. The negative autonomy framework is obviously false. That's the framework that says we always have perfect liberty until someone interferes with our choices. But because we are not born into the world as autonomous grown-ups, we have to grow into our autonomy, and so that's a complication immediately. There is a dynamic process of self-formation that the negative liberty framework ignores, and we need to have a way of deciding how people attain their capabilities. But if you take the positive autonomy point of view, privacy advocates then start to search for the dividing line between autonomy and external influence, and there is a problem of infinite regress. It's sort of social shaping all the way down. People who write about privacy from this perspective, including some of my own work, talk about then the constitution of autonomy through the way that we are socially shaped by our environments. But even that formulation contains the word autonomy in it. And in that way, privacy scholars continue, from a conceptual point of view, to insist that there still exists an autonomous core, an essential self that is identified identifiable, and that can be located after we subtract kind of the residue, after we scrape away the external influence and the social shaping. And of course, the problem is not simply that autonomy grows over time. It is that when we include autonomy in the definition of the self, we invoke a presumption about the separateness between the self and society that begs a large question that we're trying to answer. When we interrogate the conceptions of autonomy that exist in privacy theory, there is a very deep poverty, a conceptual poverty about what selves are made of, because at the bottom, our theorizing about the autonomous self rests on this presumption that there is a separate core. And trying to identify the point at which autonomy ends and social shaping begins doesn't really answer the question of what selves are made of in the first place. Now, there are other privacy theorists who say, well, okay, so that argument is right, but what that means is that privacy has to die, because if the liberal self does not exist, if the autonomous liberal self is a fiction, which we know because nearly a century of social and cultural theory and philosophy have told us that the liberal self is dead, then privacy will die with it. Privacy is part of our conception of the liberal self. Even that argument, though, I think gives away too much. The understanding of privacy as tied to the liberal conception of the autonomous self represents only one possible conception of privacy's relation to selfhood. If we start from the perspective that admits the last century of work in social and cultural theory and say, all right, the separation between self and society does not exist, then we need to think about privacy differently. From that perspective, a theory of privacy would require an understanding of the processes by which selfhood is negotiated in different contexts and over time. And the view that that means privacy has to die is wrong. Liberal privacy theorists just resist the idea of social shaping. They think you can't have both a self and social shaping. They think the one negates the other. But that's not true. Social shaping does not need to negate the self. And if we choose to say that reality is in the middle. We are neither autonomous, separate liberal selves, nor wholly dominated, socially shaped postmodernist subjects. In the middle is where we are, and in the middle is a place where we can study how selves emerge through everyday practice over time. And that view of the self opens the way, I think, to a more productive discussion about the role that privacy plays in the shaping of the self. We can say descriptively how more levels of privacy or less privacy affects the way that selfhood emerges. I'll say more about that in a moment. Okay, what's the information processing imperative? What's the second point? The information processing imperative refers to a conception of information that I think is equally theoretically untenable, and that commits the politics of privacy to losing over and over again in the courts and in the legislatures. So consider a different style of argument about why privacy is important. Another style of argument that privacy advocates make is to say, privacy is important because it serves important collective goals relating to the constitution of civil society. And therefore, we have to balance privacy interests in the constitution of civil society against the social interest in information processing, or against the government interest in information processing, or against the market interest in information processing. And in this process of balancing, sometimes privacy should win. That argument, I submit to you, gives away the game right at the beginning, because it takes for granted that interests in information processing are always rational and therefore always valid. That's the information processing imperative. Within a particular framework of rationality, more information is always better because it leads to truth. And that's a view that comes to us also from liberal political theory, from Enlightenment rationalism, in which we proceed by gathering facts and truth along a linear pathway of forward march toward progress. And against that background, of course, privacy is going to lose far more often than it is going to win, because it compromises that quintessentially liberal commitment to the free flow of information and to the pursuit of truth. And it's really easy to see why privacy is so old-fashioned, if that's what you think about information processing. But of course, if one admits the results of a century's worth of learning from those non-liberal theories, or post-liberal theories, I should say, information processing is understood to be a socially and culturally situated activity, and not something that inevitably leads to truth. Liberal theorists accept this insight a tiny little bit in the domain of racial and ethnic discrimination, but resist very hard accepting its validity in any other domain. And so we can say to ourselves, that when police in the United States arrest black motorists because they think that they are more likely to have committed a crime, or when something like the Shoah occurs and is assisted by the use of information processing technology to identify racial and ethnic undesirables, those episodes are anomalies. They are irrational. And we can say that to ourselves and continue to think that on the whole, access to information and unrestricted information processing promotes the advancement of truth, which is something that I would submit to you we need to question much more aggressively, and privacy advocates can only benefit from doing so. We must, in other words, engage directly with the information processing imperative to be effective both conceptually and politically. So the third critique of, or blind spot in liberal theories of privacy is what I call the disembodied self. The liberal autonomous self doesn't have a body, doesn't exist in a real space, doesn't change from context to context. We are all within the framework of liberal theory composed of inert matter, which is just sort of the vehicle for our transcendent immanent self. And it's a little less religious, but no less metaphysical if you transpose that insight into cybernetic theory, which is all about how information maintains constant form or constant meaning regardless of the form that it takes. But any ordinary person knows that that's wrong. Right? Any ordinary person knows that we have bodies and that we live in spaces and that we interact with different communities within those spaces, and that information takes on a different meaning in different spaces and different communities. And privacy theory has such a difficult time engaging with this reality that it can't explain, for example, why we should feel we want privacy in our bodily functions or in our sexual behavior. There's nothing particularly unique about them. Everybody does these things. And yet people have very strong feelings about the kinds of privacy that we should expect. Privacy theory has tied itself in knots trying to explain why we should want different kinds of privacy in different contexts. The best book on this, of course, is Helen Nissenbaum's book that came out last year, but she completely abandons the project of locating the self, locating the person within the context, because we have such a hard time thinking about how you might do that. And we can't abandon the project of locating the self within the context. We need to understand how selfhood is constituted and information processed in material contexts by real people. Okay, well, so what do we do with all of this? I think that putting back together an account of privacy that responds to the autonomy paradox, the information processing imperative, and the problem of the disembodied subject requires radically decentering first our concept of what the self is, what the legal subject is, who is to be protected by privacy. There is a lot of work in privacy theory on context, again, Helen Nissenbaum's being, I think, the best. Yet, when we say we need to recognize the importance of context for privacy, we're still marginalizing context compared to what I'm talking about. Context is not simply the background against we become ourselves. Subjectivity is marginal. Subjectivity is constructed at the margins in the context. It emerges at the interface between self and culture, always. We are born no selves at all, right, little babies, and everything that we become, the selves that we become, is constituted by what comes to us from the outside, by the flows of culture, by the relational networks into which we are born, and by the behaviors in which we engage as we learn how to fit ourselves into these networks within which we are always already located. If we focus on the construction of the decentered subject within social context, I have a very long, elaborate argument in the book about this, which I won't bore you with because I think I have about 5 minutes left. But at the end of that exercise comes an appreciation for two things, I think, that are critical. The first is everyday practice. Everyday practice is all the things that legal theory's account of individual behavior is not. Liberal legal theory and liberal privacy theory, too, likes to argue that people's behaviors can be explained or subsumed within overarching frameworks, whether those frameworks are about freedom of expression in political situations or about freedom of choice in markets. We have these grand overarching narratives that we like to use to explain how the world should be organized. Everyday practice is everything that doesn't fit into the grand overarching narratives. It is all the kind of muddled up heterogeneous things that all of us do all the time, every day, some of which are about freedom of expression, some of which are about freedom of economic choice, and many of which are about other things. Second thing, in addition to everyday practice, is play. We play, and our circumstances play around us. We play because we try on identities, we try on new ideas, we try on attitudes and personae, we try on new friendships, we try on new occupations. All of these things are deliberate, and they are ways of constructing ourselves over time. But we also encounter serendipity in our surroundings. Our circumstances play with us. We are subjected to encounters with new ideas, new artifacts, new practices, new communities, new behaviors. And part of our evolving subjectivity is our engagement with these things that serendipitously come into our paths and our responding to serendipity within our everyday practice. Within the play of everyday practice, privacy has, from a descriptive point of view, a far more simple function than the protection of already fixed autonomous subjects, and in fact, an opposite function. Privacy shelters our evolving selves, not our fixed selves, from attempts by the environment, by businesses and governments and other actors to fix us, to make us predictable. What is evolving is the self, and the fixity is coming from the outside. Privacy then, from a descriptive point of view, refers to the practices in which individuals and communities engage to manage their boundaries. to regulate what they disclose to others, which others they disclose to, and how they make those disclosures. It's not a fixed or an absolute thing, but a dynamic process, a differentiated process of socially situated boundary management. And what ought to be protected, for privacy to be protected, then, is the breathing room that situated subjects require to engage in that process of boundary management, which they require to develop as subjects and to function within society, to pursue their everyday practices, and to pursue the process by which they change and grow and evolve as subjects. Importantly, I want to stress that while this model of privacy doesn't comport with liberal assumptions about reality, because it starts from a very different view of the self, it advances liberal aspirations, and in particular the central liberal aspiration to facilitate critical subjectivity. You become someone possessed of critical subjectivity, I would argue, only so long as you maintain the capacity for boundary management, and only so long as you continue as a subject to evolve. If there is no protection for the process of boundary management and no protection for the play of everyday practice within which all of us situated subjects engage, then there is no possibility of attaining critical subjectivity, and that should be something that privacy advocates can make up a lot of ground by arguing. I think I've probably run through my 20 minutes and then some, so I think that's a good place to stop. I have some thoughts about how privacy policy might proceed based on this view of situated subjectivity, and how privacy advocates might make arguments that proceed from a more realistic view of who the subject is and what information processing is, and perhaps we can come back to those later in the question and answer. So thank you very much.